and welcome to next session. My name is Emma with NAN. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Cassandra Spade from Gigikino'amawigonaanig is here to talk to us about Gigikino'amawigonaanig, Mitigoog, land-based learning with trees. Cassandra Spade is a grassroots human rights activist from the Mitigoog First Nation. She is the founder of Gigikino'amawigonaanig, a grassroots organization that develops cultural and language revitalization programming. Her work is community-driven and focuses on culture and language revitalization programming. Her work is community-driven and focuses on relationship building, relocalization, youth leadership, community healing, and accessibility. She holds a BA from the University of Manitoba, a certificate in Community Economics and Social Development, CESD, from Algoma University, and is a graduate from Ojibwe Motadida Oma Gigikino'amawigonaanig, or OOG. Cassandra Spade.
Buju miigwech min Cassandra Ndishnikas Gema Kasindagugaye Mishkigogomangindonji Kuchacheng Ishgunaganing Ingiji Ombikaye Namain Dotam Namigwech Wenda Maya Yekoma Wasukone Yekoma Gaye. And yeah, so hello everyone. My name's Cassandra, but most people call me Cass, and you are more than welcome to if you ever see me. I'm from Mitigoog First Nation, but I also grew up on Kuchacheng, Beisho Ima, close to Fort Frances, Ontario, and I come from the Sturgeon clan. I'm very excited to be here with you today and to be seeing everyone in a digital space or in a new way of communicating. And other than that, I will get into my presentation very shortly. I would just like to acknowledge that I know we are all dealing with a heavy time right now, so please host yourself well. And if you need to take a break from the screen, please do. Have your tea ready and whatever you need to make yourself comfortable. And I hope you enjoy the next 45 minutes we have together and we can get into some questions. Okay, so here we go. So there are two stories I would like to share even before we get into the presentation, and I think they're really fitting to talk about. So I am a second language learner. I am learning my language and will be learning it for the rest of my life, but I'm very much dedicated to it. And so the way I grew up was I grew up on a reservation in a very pervasively English education system. And so English was taught to me as being the most economically viable and the most socially viable language. If I wanted to have a good job, if I wanted to be a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, I needed to have English. And if I wanted to get an even better job, I needed to learn French because those are the official languages of Canada. And so I studied English and French throughout all of my schooling. That idea carried and stayed with me even when I went to university. And I ended up learning German. So my BA is in German language, and I studied in Northern Germany. So this idea that there are economic or economically viable or languages that support specific jobs such as English, French, and German, those are things that I grew up with, and those are very dominant ideas I grew up with. When I had finished my BA, I had decided I wanted to make meaningful change in my community. And that was the whole point of going to school, was that I wanted to go back home and I wanted to give back to my community the same way it gave to me. And so I was thinking, maybe I will go to law school. And I started writing the LSAT and getting ready for law school. But then I started to feel very disconnected, thinking about all the time I already spent away from my community, going to high school, going to post-secondary, and so on. And I started to have a lot of dreams about the land and returning back to my grandparents and not being able to communicate to them sometimes not having that Anishinaabemowin ability. And so I started to think maybe, just maybe, this is the universe or this is my family reaching out to me to tell me it's time to go back home. So I put law school on the back burner just for a little bit, and I will return to it eventually. But right now my focus is on language. And when I came back home, I was greeted with open arms from a lot of elders to start learning, and a lot of people in my community. And so I owe all of my language learning to all of the elders who have invested so much time into me and really honoring the space and giving me the space to learn and to cry, because language is also a healing process. And for me, language is very much reinforces my identity and my worldview. And it keeps that connection to my home strong so that I don't ever have to question where I come from or who I am. And one of the elders, when I started learning, said to me that if you take care of language, it will always take care of you. And that is something that I continue to carry on. And growing up on a reservation, I was a very, very shy child and very intimidated by speaking publicly and having voice. But it was when I started taking care of language and starting to put my time into it that I felt more comfortable and confident speaking in spaces. So I am a youth, I am a second language learner, and I will continue learning my language. All of the mispronunciations or grammar mistakes that I make are my own and not my elders. And other than that, I just want to carry that message that if you take care of language, it takes care of you, and it centers all of the work that I do. So as they were introducing me, they talked about the organization Gigikino'amawigonaanig, which means the ones who speak kindly to themselves. It is a youth-focused organization that is up and coming, and we received our first grants last year to run online spaces and just small mini virtual challenges to create community with youth online. This year, we're really hoping to start stepping into the space of gaining more funding for language programming at any possible level and way that we can. So we're very much grassroots, we're community focused, and we're just a bunch of youth from our community who love our community. All right, so now that I've said that, I have another story to share. And this is the story that birthed the idea of this presentation. So I worked as an immersion teacher at a school called Advocacy in the United States, in Wisconsin. And I worked with a kindergarten class, and it was such a privilege and a pleasure to be in an immersion space where these kids never knew me in English. They only ever knew me as an Anishinaabemowin speaker. And so they would have to come and have a conversation with me and speak only in the language. And it's so cute when you see a bunch of little kids running around screaming different Anishinaabemowin words and never knowing the English words for some things like agamak, agamak, my snowshoe, ndegamak. And so these kids would be running around still speaking a little bit of English, but then inserting Ojibwe because that was all they knew how to describe those things. And one day when we were at the school, we did a lot of land-based immersion learning. So we take the kids wild ricing, birch bark harvesting, snowshoe walking, and so on. In the springtime, we go in the sugar bush and collect all that sap. And so we took the kindergartners on this bus. It was a clear, sunny day, crisp, kind of chilly, snow on the ground. And the kindergartners went running out and they're running in the sugar bush playing. And some of the young kids started ripping branches off of these trees and start playing with them. And I went up to them and I started talking about how we have a relationship to trees. And if you talk to those trees, you can hear them. And if you really listen, you can hear them. And so I was saying how these trees are living beings and that they give us so much. They're giving us syrup and air and all of these other things. And one of the little kids noticed a knot on the tree and went, an eye, there's an eye in the tree. And all the other little kids went and looked at those eyes and they said, oh my goodness, those trees really do see us. And there was an immediate shift from a Western Eurocentric worldview that sees trees as a resource, as something that we can exploit or use, to this shift of an Anishinaabeg worldview where our trees are our relatives and we have a relationship to them, and that we want to honor that relationship through reciprocity, respect, and relationships. And so the kindergartners put the branches back and the sticks back, and they start talking with the trees and really honoring those trees and maintaining that relationship. And so that is what birthed the idea of this presentation, was that the trees teach us. And so I thank all of that and that idea to those young ones who continue to teach me, even though I am still a young one. And lastly, I know that's a long introduction to all of this, I would just like to point out that the artwork that I'm using in this presentation is by a young artist named Jared Tate from the North as well, and it's called Little Hummingbird Boy. And I think it's very telling of the presentation. All right, so now that we've gone through the introduction and you know a little bit more about me and the reason why this presentation exists and what it's for, I want to start going into the immersion advocacy and the immersion activism piece, talking about language revitalization. We'll move into grammar patterns and how second language learners can use this and how mother tongue speakers can use this as well. And lastly, all of you should have access or have received the immersion lesson plan with the worksheet. And this is in Anishinaabemowin, but you are all invited to change it into whichever languages suit your communities or are reflective of your communities. Okay, so when we talk about language statistics, sometimes it can be a little daunting because it feels like we're up against a lot. And it is true, but we do have the power and the agency and the choice, and we can make changes to this. So in the national scope across Canada, we have 75 Indigenous languages. Not a single one, yes, not a single one is protected, preserved, or supported, or federally funded. None of them, all 75 of them. And as a result of it, all of them are vulnerable or face the severe prospect of extinction within the next few decades. Many of those languages having less than a dozen speakers. This might not be the case for Northern Ontario, though, because we have a lot of language speakers still. And so we are at this critical, crucial point where we can make changes and address the rapid decline of our languages. And so when we think of the Indigenous population of Canada, we make up about 4 to 5% of the population, or 1.6 million. And I want to draw your attention to this graph that I have that is about conversational Indigenous language speakers. So this is still in the national context. And from the census reports in 2006, 21.4% of our population could have a conversation in an Indigenous tongue. It did not mean that they were a mother tongue speaker or that they were a second language speaker. Whatever they were able to have a conversation. And in just 10 short years, 1 decade, it drops 5% and it becomes 15.6% of our Indigenous population having conversations. And we see that in some communities, that drop is much larger because they only have 12 speakers in their community and are facing the severe prospect of that language not being passed on. So I'm sharing this just to show the severity of language, but I'm well aware that you probably all know this too. And so one of the national reports that came out said that 1 in 3 elders is a mother tongue speaker of an Indigenous language. And then when we see in the grandchildren how much is not being passed on, it's 1 in 10 children are mother tongue speakers. And so that is something that we really need to start thinking critically about and consciously about and addressing the issue of rapid language loss and decline. So an example that I would like to show you is a piece of policy activism or advocacy, and we can target language decline at many different levels, at the federal, the provincial, the municipal, even in our school boards. We can do it at the grassroots level, but specifically in this case, we're just going to talk about advocacy, changing policy. And so in the province of Ontario, we have this thing called the Ontario College of Teachers, and it's called a native language teacher policy. And so in order to become a language teacher in our communities, our language speakers have to become teachers. They have to go through this program. And some of the limitations are in this policy. They create huge barriers to our communities, and specifically those communities that are fly-in or remote access, but are also really unique pockets of identity. So I don't want to say remoteness as something that is not accessible. Those places are very much accessible. And so what happens is when someone's a mother tongue speaker and they want to become a teacher in their community, they cannot go into a publicly funded school without being recognized by the Ontario College of Teachers. So 1, they must be in good standing with the Ontario College of Teachers in the publicly funded schools. 2, the education must be completed at a post-secondary level and cannot be employment-based. Huge barrier, because a lot of our language teachers and language speakers are already doing that work. And so this just creates a barrier and a challenge to getting our teachers into the schools and into those programs so that we can start doing immersion programming and pay them adequately for the work that they do. And lastly, when we think of post-secondary, these teachers must go through 4 semesters. And I don't know about you, but my education journey was all over the place. And it took me a little bit of time, much longer than 2 years. And so we start to see that this policy, just this one policy, has so many barriers and challenges for our language teachers in our communities. So if we want to make change at a policy level, we can advocate for education, that Indigenous education, to be funded publicly, to advocate for our communities to develop their own mechanisms and own policies and ways of recognizing our knowledge teachers and language speakers, because from our communities, we know who is doing what, and we know what kind of knowledges people are carrying. And so those are just 2 ways that we can address policy that is creating a lot of barriers. But I don't want to get all bogged down in policy only and just continue talking about that. There are lots of ways to make change, and we can do this in many different intersections and avenues. And I think policy activism is always a good piece just to always have there and to be aware of. And when someone comes to you, you can say, there are 75 languages that are Indigenous in Canada. Not one of them is protected. One of the things impacting this is the native language teacher policy, and then insert what you want to change. So that's a really great way to start, just in 30 seconds, advocating for change. So stepping away from policy, we can look at other ways to create language programming. So for myself, the majority of my language learning was not in publicly funded schools. So I did not do it in elementary or high school or in university. I learned my language by coming home to my community and going to Indigenous immersion spaces. So in my introduction, it spoke about Gigikino'amawigonaanig, which is an immersion academy in the United States. And in that community, they pool their money together to fund this immersion program. It is not part of a university or a college or anything like that. And it's a space where we come together for 2 weeks in the summertime in complete immersion that is structured and set up for us as second language adult learners. So there's also a very specific goal in that. So we can think of doing immersion camps on the weekend, in the summertime, and then we want to really gear what we're teaching to the specific age demographic, because young people are like sponges, just like those kindergartners running around. They pick up things so quickly. You don't even have to explain it to them. They just in one ear and they're like, okay, got it for the rest of my life. But as adult language learners, we know it's a little bit of a struggle, and it takes a lot of time and commitment to dedicate yourself. So when we develop immersion programs, we have to recognize at what stage people are at, what age they're at. I also want to share this story of this language nest. So I went to the United Nations once in my life before the pandemic, and you could go places. And I met these Hawaiian women, and they had this giant immersion school in their community. And they told me the birth of the school, the story of this school. And there were 6 language speakers left in their communities, 6 grandmothers who were mother tongue speakers. And what they started to do at the grassroots level was they went into the Macy's, the JCPenney's, the malls, and they started telling Hawaiian women, oh, bring your babies to us, please, on the weekend, bring them to our house, bring them to our little facility. And so they got a small cohort of these Hawaiian babies, and those 6 women, alongside second language learners, transferred all of that language into those babies. And from those 6 women, they now have revitalized their entire community, and they have immersion schools, and their young people are fluent in their languages. So I want to highlight that to say that although we're experiencing rapid language decline, we still are at a crucial point where we can make that change, and we need to start doing it now. curriculum that met the state guidelines or the state expectations, which can be a little bit challenging. And so, oh, it's saying my internet connection's unstable. It's good. I'm good. Okay. So when I was working there, I had to develop curriculum that met the state expectations, but then at the same time, the challenges. How do I ensure that children get that Indigenous worldview or the Anishinaabeg worldview? Just like that story of those young kindergartners in the sugar bush and how it switched from this Western Eurocentric worldview into the Anishinaabe. Because part of it is that we don't want to just translate work into our language. We want it to be from our communities and from our worldview and the way that we interact with the world. And so one of the things that I have found best for me, specifically as a second language learner, and when I'm developing curriculum, is learning about grammar patterns. So when you're an adult, you have to take the time, all the time in the world, to learn grammar patterns. Okay, so today I'm going to go through one type of grammar pattern, and we're going to talk about grammar for a little bit. So in the Anishinaabe language, or Anishinaabemowin, we have these different forms of grammar. We have A form. An A form is a sentence that stands alone. It's an independent clause. It doesn't need any other things around it. And it's full of these things called prefixes and suffixes. So if I want to say, I'm entering, nabindige, I'm entering. If I want to say, they're entering, I remove the ne, so I use bindige, wug. Wug indicates they. And that is a standalone sentence. I don't have to say anything else. It just exists as it is. It's independent. And so in the A form, it can have prefixes and suffixes, but it stands alone. In the example I have here, we have kisana, it is cold. When we move on to the B form, it gets a little bit different. So this is dependent. It's a dependent type of sentence. It needs something else, and it's an incomplete form. And so what that means is I would never just go, when I went inside, when I go inside, when I enter. You're kind of thinking, okay, what happens when you enter? What's going on? And so it needs something to stand with it. And when we're using B form, it doesn't have the prefixes on the front of the verb. They're just on the end, and they're different. So when I enter, bindige yan, when I enter, it is cold. Bindige yan kisna, it is cold when I enter. And so we start to see how that sentence structure is working and these different forms are working. And lastly, we have this thing called C form, which can be a little bit challenging to learn, but I promise if you take the time, you will get there, because if I can do it, you can do it. And so C form, it takes the suffix of the B form and it adds an initial vowel change. So if I was going to say in the past tense, it was cold, Gigikino'amawigonaanig, it was cold. But now I want to change it into a noun or something that I can talk about. So the place where it is cold or where it is cold, I would go take the gi and change it into a's. So ga, gisanag, and I'd put the suffix, the ending on it. So that's just a brief, very fast introduction to show you all of the different forms that we have in Anishinaabemowin. And so when we start to understand grammar, we can start really picking out pieces that elders are saying or mother tongue speakers are saying and use them in our curriculum. And so this is definitely a point of view as a second language learner, how I am learning from the elders or the mother tongue speakers and how I'm carrying that grammar and then inserting it into curriculum or immersion planning and lesson planning. So the grammar pattern I'd like to share with you today is a very good one to know. It's called Gishpin plus B form. Gishpin means if. Gishpin plus B form. And we know that B form is dependent. So if we say, if it rains, it's a dependent clause. We want to know some more information. It will be a good day. So Gishpin gimiwang, if it rains, damino gijigan. You might say gijigan or gijigat. It just depends on which community you're coming from in the Anishinaabe world. So we can also take that same grammar pattern and apply it in a different sentence. Gishpin nibasiwan inga nishkatis. If I don't sleep, I'm gonna be angry. And lastly, the sentence I want to really focus on is the one that I use in the immersion planning. So when I am planning something for students, I want to really reinforce specific grammar patterns. And so in the lesson plan I provided all of you with, we're talking about trees, and we want to develop observational skills and thinking skills and hypothesis skills with the students. So I would say, if it's winter, what happens to the tree? Because we want the students to know the cycles of trees. So gishpin bebung anin and nakamigizit wa'au wikopiwatig. What happens to that tree? And so this is just an example of how important grammar is to know and how important it is to insert it into lesson planning. Specifically from a second language learner's point of view. But if you're a mother tongue speaker, I would definitely recommend to sit down and reflect on the types of ways that you speak and really start digging into them and thinking, okay, what is something that I often say? Because, for example, an if-then sentence, like for example, like gishpin plus be form is an if-then conditional sentence. And I know it's getting all linguistic-y and grammar-y, and that's kind of like, not as fun as the speaking. But when you start to find those patterns as a mother tongue speaker or as a second language learner, it's really, really beneficial to your students, because then they'll start to pick it up quickly and they'll start to understand the flow. And this is really important when you're working with adult language learners too, because they need that consistency and that stability. All right, so when we start to put those grammar patterns into our lesson planning, the lesson plan I have here is tree cycles, and there are a couple different things that you can do in those trees, in those plants. So first and foremost, I always make a language focus and a goal. I make one for myself, and I make one for the learners or the kindergartners or whoever I'm doing language work with. And so my personal goal is maybe I want to learn a new grammar pattern that week, or I really want to focus on, in the language, there are these things called initials, medials, and finals. and they're just ways of describing verbs. So the initial might indicate that it's a brown leaf and it has that description. So that's kind of how it's like a Lego kind of thing. If you take the time, you'll definitely start to notice it in the language. And I remember some of my elders talking about when they were kids, they would find an object and they would want to describe it in the most peculiar, funny, realistic way that they could. So they would just start attaching all these different descriptor pieces onto describing this thing. And so that's a really great idea to do with your students, is to go through initial, medials, and finals and to describe things with them and get them used to that. So I always want to have a language focus, a language goal. I personally love playing with initial, medials, and finals. So things like nagaze, it looks like, and then you can insert guayaka nagaze, it looks straight, or whatever it may be. And so secondly, we just learned our grammar pattern, the if plus be form. We can insert that into the focus and the goal, and it creates a stability for that week or for that lesson for the students, so they can really become acquainted and familiarized with that specific language focus or lesson focus. Okay, so the next piece, I hope you're all enjoying tea out there, and I wish I could see you all. Okay, so now that I have my language focus and my goals, and I'm looking for grammar patterns whenever possible, because sometimes, well, specifically as a second language learner, we have to fake it until we make it. But in saying that, when we transfer it to the kids, specifically the younger kids, they'll never have to fake it. They're always going to make it, and they're always going to know. So when I am making a lesson plan, I always look at the provincial curriculum expectations, what is expected of the certain grade that I'm working with, which I'm sure if all of you are working in education, you're much more familiar with it and probably have gone through a Bachelor of Education program or something like that. I have not. And so this is kind of my technique to do that. I find the provincial curriculum expectations or state, and I read through it and I pick out the pieces. Okay, I can instill in my learners, for example, developing hypotheses and observation in kindergarten. This is locating patterns and knowing that type of thing. Understanding stability and change. Well, trees are a great example of change because they go through cycles. And they're also a great example of the way Anishinaabe tell time or experience seasons and things like that. And so this lesson plan ends up being focused on science in this case, because I want the learners to develop those provincial curriculum standards and expectations, but I also want them to do it in a way that's most reflective of my community. And when I was working at the school, some of the concerns that people had was that the children were not getting the education they needed to go to post-secondary or become a lawyer and doctor and so on. Well, I'm here to tell you that those kids picked up these concepts and these ideas so quickly and could do it in both languages. They were able to speak it in English, but also speak it in Anishinaabe. So there was really no challenge to developing and supporting their education path. In fact, knowing more than one language promotes better understanding and better learning. It also pushes against the way down the line, like later mental health issues or memory loss. It pushes against that because your brain is actively engaging in all of these different ways. And so when I'm doing my curriculum, I don't just want to translate the provincial standards and expectations, and it requires a lot of time. But I take those expectations, those ideas, and I reflect them in an Anishinaabe worldview. And I found it to be pretty easy to do once I got the flow of it. So then I would have my language focus goals, my learning objectives that met the provincial curriculum expectations when and where I needed to, and then the materials needed. Well, when I do lesson planning, I always have like a worksheet or an assignment to do with the kids, but then I also really want to engage them in outdoor space. So I try to find some kind of land component or relationship to land that we can engage in. And so the structured activity that I've come up with for this particular lesson plan was to talk about seasons and trees, asking the questions, oh, what happens in spring? And engage the learners in asking those types of questions. So, anin and nakamikak ga ziguang, something like that. What happens in the springtime? And get those kids to try to really engage in that. And then I would push it further and I would start inserting that grammar pattern. Okay, well, if it's spring, Gishpin Ziguang, what happens to the trees? What do you start to see? And we would start to describe them and really pull at those medials and those initials and those finals, those pieces, those Lego blocks of Ojibwe. And so the whole point was just to get kids engaged in speaking as much as possible. And with younger kids, this is so easy to do because they just want to shout out answers all the time. And then I would provide these optional types of work that we could do together. So maybe we wanted to go for a nature walk and collect leaves or things around trees, locate trees, identify them, and so on. Or we could do basket weaving and birch bark harvesting. I remember growing up a lot of stories about collecting firewood, so sharing stories. And lastly, you can do an art component where you take those leaf patterns and you trace them and you look at the veins of the leaves and things like that. So really what I'm saying is that the possibilities are endless once you kind of have a direction and you know where you're going with your own language ability and your focus that week. And so when we would assess the kids or the language learners, one of the biggest things was just having a conversation and being able to see the kids engage with the language and being able to respond and really supporting them in responding in any kind of way. And then at the same time, there was that science component of the observational skills and recognizing patterns and all those types of things. So immersion planning takes time, but once you have a very clear focus on your own language and a very clear goal in your own language, it's very easy to just kind of jump in with the kids and get there. And usually when I'm in the space too, I have my own book that I carry with me always. And if I don't know that word that day, I go home and I call my granny, my nokum, or my whoever, Gigikino'amawigonaanig. And I'm like, oh, I just couldn't figure out this word today. I don't know how to say it. And then we have a conversation. I'm like, how would you say that? Or what could you say? And so I always have a book on me when I am in immersion spaces. And so the next day when the kids ask me, we can really focus on that word or whatever. Also, when you're teaching in immersion spaces, there are going to be a million times, specifically if you're a second language learner, that you don't know how to say something or you don't know how to say it in a polite way. And so I always try to give myself little phrases that I can use or sayings that I can sprinkle in throughout the week. And really, it's just about committing myself to ensuring that I provide the best immersion space possible. And in saying that, I also want to talk about like the school, like Advocacy, which is the school I was working with. And in the morning, we would have a morning prayer. The children would they would pass tobacco to someone, and another little kindergartner would say the morning prayer, and they would go out together and put the tobacco out. On Tuesdays, we would have big drum society. So the boys would all start drumming and the girls would sing and dance. And so there are a lot of events that we would do that were just really reflective of our communities. And yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel when we make immersion planning because there are already so many great organizations doing this. For example, Waking Up Ojibwe Motarida, Gigikino'amawigonaanig, Oog, the school. And so just knowing that these things exist and looking to them for guidance is definitely also a great way to develop your immersion planning. And yeah, one of my favorite things about the school is on Mondays, we would have a big drum and all of the classes would come together and all the kids would dance together, and just that's how we'd open the week. Okay, so just to touch briefly on the lesson plan that I've prepared, it's very bare, but I think one of the great things about it is that it just allows the kids to be imaginative or expressive and do whatever is most comfortable to them. So my focus on this lesson plan is the Wikopiwatik, or the wikob tree, the pulling tree. And this is what is used for like birch bark baskets and things like that. Some people use spruce roots, but for this lesson plan, I use the Wikopiwatik. That tree, I think it's called a small basswood tree. I don't know, the pulling tree. And so I have the different cycles here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the children would draw what the gishpin bibung, if it's winter, what does the tree look like? Draw here, gishpin zipuang, draw here, gishpin nibing, and so on. But then in the last section, it's draw what you give the tree and what the tree gives you. So whenever we're harvesting or requesting something from the tree, we want to give sema, mijam, maybe clothing or ribbon. So give them tobacco, food, ribbons, whatever it may be, because we recognize we have a relationship to the tree, just like that story in the beginning. And so we always want to remind our children, what are we giving and what does the tree give us? And so then in the box beside it, it's all about, oh, what do we get from what does the Wikopiwatik give us? And Wikopiwatik gives us a lot of things. And so that's just a little bit about the lesson planning and really just reinforcing our relationship to learning with trees and to trees, because I think it's true. Like if you really listen, you can hear that the trees are teaching us a lot of things. And so that's kind of what I wanted to pass on to the children. So lastly, before I conclude, because we're coming to the end and hopefully we have some great questions to talk about and hopefully I can provide some answers. But so I talk a lot about being a second language learner and specifically that perspective and how it's important that I understand grammar patterns and I know grammar and I'm able to pick grammar from elders and carry it and take care of the language and then transfer it to the younger ones or the other people learning the language. And I have to be very aware of how grammar works. Well, if you're a mother tongue speaker and you maybe don't have that formalized grammar training, there's this great book by Patricia Ningwans, and it's a Reclaiming Our Territory Word by Word, Grassroots Indigenous Learning. And she is a beautiful elder who carries such love for our communities and wants to teach and revitalize language and just I could not say better things about her. She's very wonderful. And so if you're a fluent speaker or a mother tongue speaker, this is a great resource to have because it gives you structure so you can reinforce grammar patterns for your kids and for your students. And you don't necessarily have to know what a medial is or a final or an initial or what B, A, C forms are, but you just have to know how to speak and how to say these things. So an example is she asks the question, do you know Gigikino'amawigonaanig, do you know this person? And so you already start to learn that specific form of language. So there are really great tools out in the world. You can look towards the schools for immersion planning. And overall, I just hope that the focus that I conveyed or the message that I conveyed is how critically important immersion learning is and immersion spaces are for revitalizing languages and addressing rapid language decline. And I hope that the stories that I shared with you and the way that I go through a lesson plan give you the tools or maybe spark some inspiration to just start doing it now. Start addressing that policy, start making lesson plans, start doing grassroots gatherings, start speaking language in any capacity that you can. Because if we take care of our language, it's going to take care of us. And I strongly believe that language reinforces worldview, it reinforces identity, and it's a huge proponent to suicide prevention. Knowing my language has given me all of the lovely, beautiful strength that I have today to present to you, because every time I go to a presentation, I'm so nervous, but I say to myself, I am loved, and I know that my community loves me. So with that, Miigwech, thank you for sharing the space with me. And of course, the lovely artist who allowed me to share his work with you. You can find his artwork at jaredtate.com. And yeah, other than that, we'll get to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Cassie. It was awesome. We don't have a lot of time left, so there were quite a few amazing questions asked on the page. Let's see which one. We have time for maybe one. How are you reaching your students during this time when they cannot attend school due to pandemic restrictions?
Yeah, so this year I actually, my husband and I came back to Canada, so we weren't working in the school anymore, and he was pursuing a Bachelor's of Education. But I know that the school has been running a lot of online programming with their students and doing short spurts. And now that vaccinations are coming out in the United States, they've been engaging their kids outdoors and in those spaces. And land-based is the best ventilation you can have. And so there's no better way than to be on the land and be healthy.
Miigwech, awesome, thank you. Miigwech, thank you very much. Cass, there are many more questions. We will get those posted, I suppose, and sent out. And again, thank you very much.
I would just like to say, if we save the questions, I can answer them and then we can send them out via email, just to make sure that everyone received the lesson plan, the worksheet, and then contact information, and we can do the questions too. So I apologize for the short time.
Awesome, thank you. I would like to invite the tech team to play our Play to Win code, and a reminder that after that, coming up next, we will have a short break and then head back to the agenda just before 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, EDT, to go to the next session. Miigwech. Thank you.